Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I want to tell you a bit about what I've been reading these last few weeks for Jane Austen July. The first book I finished was the wonderful new work of history by Rory Muir called Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen. I adored this book, and even though it was published by an academic press, I would strongly recommend it to any reader who loves Jane Austen, even if you've never read academic history before. Charlotte of Coiny Reads also just read this book and gave a really great discussion of the book over on her channel. Basically, Muir arranges his chapters in the order of relationships. How did marital partners first meet during the Regency period? How did they, we might say date now, but how did they court each other? What if things didn't progress to marriage? And if things did continue swimmingly, what was the engagement period like? What did wedding ceremonies look like, etc. The author also talks about people who stayed unmarried, spinsters and bachelors, as they would have been called at the time, and considers what their reasons were for staying single, as well as what their options in life could be, depending on their situations. And then Muir talks about the experiences of marriage as the years go by in a relationship, the raising of children, instances of adultery or domestic violence, the possibilities of divorce, widowhood, etc. For those of you who are heavily devoted to the importance of plot in a book, what I'm about to say may not make any sense, but for those of you who are most connected to the characters in Jane Austen, reading Muir's historical study is almost like finding a new novel by Jane Austen. The historian's major sources are the letters and diaries of historical people, real people, who lived at the time that Austen's characters lived. And as we hear their own very personal accounts of their daily lives, it's easy to feel right back in that space where Austen usually fits. So yes, I strongly recommend this book. In addition to reading books by Jane Austen, and books specifically about Jane Austen and her time, this theme reading month of Jane Austen July includes prompts that ask us to read work that is more Austen adjacent. Perhaps a contemporary retelling of an Austen book, or perhaps a novel set during Austen's time period. I read one of each. The first one is a modern retelling of Persuasion. Let me start out by saying that I was pretty skeptical about this one. I had heard that this particular novel was a contemporary romance novel, and I was a little worried that I might not be able to deal with a mashup of Austen with anything, quote, spicy. Still, I tracked down a copy and thought I would give it a try. Then I read a customer review that said the novel was, quote, stupid, and it said it had almost nothing to do with Jane Austen's book. I almost didn't open the book after that, but I am so glad I did. First, while the story doesn't precisely follow specific details in Persuasion, it does follow the basic bones of Austen's plot. And interestingly, it also has a very direct connection to Pride and Prejudice as well, which I had not seen mentioned before. Even better, the main character is a literature professor who studies women writers in the 19th century, and the character talks quite a bit about Jane Austen and Persuasion, as well as other novels of this era. More on that in a minute. I'm not sure I've said this yet, but the novel is called By the Book and was written by Julia Sonneborn. I think the first question is, what genre is this book? I've certainly heard a lot of people call it romance, and the romantic choices made by the central female character clearly are at the center of the plot, as are the ups and downs of dating life. On the other hand, it could also be considered book club fiction as well, and even has a whole book group discussion guide included at the end of the novel. Given my extraordinarily limited experience with contemporary romance as a genre, I would love to know if the rest of you would classify it this way. Surely romance books can encourage fantastic discussions in book clubs, so perhaps both classifications of romance as well as book club fiction work hand in hand here. So I mentioned that in addition to possibly being a romance novel and a book club pick, this is also a campus novel about a professor and her colleagues and students. A light one, not dark academia. The main character, Anne Corey, teaches literature at a fairly elite West Coast college. Even though we don't hear a lot about her scholarship other than a reference to a topic which seems wildly broad to me, we do hear Anne talk a lot about the lives of not only writers of the early 19th century, like Jane Austen, but also classic Victorian novelists from later in the century as well, hence 19th century rather than Victorian or Regency. Anne loves Austen, but also George Eliot and Charlotte Bronte and the like. Yes, there is a lot in this novel about Jane Eyre. We learned fairly early on that while Anne has always been drawn to the romance of characters like Darcy and Rochester, she's intent on approaching them in a more academically rigorous way. Here's what she says she tries to teach her students, even though she doesn't quite believe it down deep. Quote, "These novels weren't about love. They were about money and power and imperialism and real estate." We also get to know the chair of her department, who is a medievalist, as well as her best friend, who studies Henry James. About that best friend, he gets both a ridiculous plotline and a lot of really funny lines. And in my opinion, it's portrayed in this over-the-top way that feels just too much, just too stereotypically gay for me, even though the portrayal is utterly accepting and embracing even. Perhaps my hesitation here is just a Gen X thing. Anyway, characters in this book spend time in a variety of research libraries, and we even hear a bit about the publication process a couple of the characters go through, including one at a very prestigious university press, Oxford University Press. After reading about this setting, it really wasn't a surprise to find out that Julia Sonneborn is actually a pen name of an academic, a professor who studies 19th century women writers and writes about the subject under her real name, Julia Lee. One of her books is now on my list to try to hunt down for Victober. That particular book of hers was published by Oxford University Press in 2010 and is called The American Slave Narrative and the Victorian Novel. For those of you who don't memorize all the details of my life, I trained as an historian with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century Southern history, especially about race. So her slave narrative book is right up my alley. It considers how Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte Bronte, Thackeray, and others were directly influenced by American slave narratives as they wrote their very British novels. It sounds fascinating. Wish me luck as I try to find a copy to read that won't leave me broke. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed by the book. Note that I'm not saying it's a great book. I suggested before that Sonneborn sometimes goes too far with stereotypes, not just the gay character, but some of the situations too. The plot is a little torturous, maybe, but nevertheless, there's something really utterly charming about it all. A really enjoyable diversion, at least for nerds. I was surprised by the fact that I did not love Georgette Heyer's Regency romance, The Grand Sophy, which I read immediately after I finished by the book. Let me say right up front that it is objectively a much better book. In fact, I think that might be why I was disappointed. When I was reading by the book, I never even imagined that it could measure up to Jane Austen herself. It seemed like a silly comparison. Instead, the book was just an entertaining diversion. But The Grand Sophy? Well, in several ways, it does kind of beg for a comparison with Jane Austen. Sophy herself, that titular character, is a spunky young woman, not unlike Emma, who winds up in a relationship she doesn't necessarily expect. Even just the fact that it's set in Jane Austen's world might make it awfully tempting to put Heyer and Austen side by side. And while Higher, at least in this novel, has much of Austen's charm, she doesn't have all of it. The characters are all much flatter than I think Austen would have written them, and whatever wit gets displayed just isn't nearly as sharp as what I think Jane would have produced. Yes, I smiled almost the whole time I was reading this book, but when I read Austen, I have trouble not laughing aloud the whole time. And on top of that, Austen has the ability to offer some kind of insight into how characters grow and change. And in general, I felt like Higher's characters were far more static than Austen's. And there was another issue. I've been thinking a lot lately about the issue of books that display the personal politics of the time different from our own. There's the whole issue of separating art from the artist, but there's also the issue of reading books that might have attitudes about, well, let's take the example of racial attitudes in the work of William Faulkner, which we'll be thinking about next month during Faulkner in August. That is, times when it isn't about the author outside the text, but actually what appears in the text that might disturb us in some ways. I read a lot of fiction and nonfiction written at times when people held radically different ideas about what was appropriate for women or for people of color, for queer people, even simply non-elites of any stripe. And I don't hesitate to read books like that at all. If authors are much crueler than typical for their time and place, I do sometimes resist. But I'm still quite aware in general of context and can usually look past ideology that I suspect authors would not spout today if they were still writing, especially if there are things of great value in the novels as well. There are several moments in The Grand Sophy that I kind of rolled my eyes about, like an over-the-top anti-Semitic trope. I found it irksome, but essentially irrelevant. But in the end, I really struggled with a different issue. When I say in the end, I'm serious, so you might want to skip ahead to the next timestamp, which I will try to remember to insert, if you don't want any spoilers. I'll try to be subtle here anyway. As we expect from the very beginning, the book ends with Sophy having a romantic partner. What I didn't expect is that the language of their romance casts it as cruelty and physical force. I'll admit that I'm perhaps overly sensitive to even mild references to that kind of behavior in relationships. In the book, the love interest grabs Sophy by the shoulders and shakes her, then embraces her even as she protests. And I want to read out the man's proposal and her response. He says, "Will you marry me, vile and abominable girl that you are?" And she responds, "Yes, but mind, it is only to save my neck from being wrung." I know these lines are supposed to suggest that same kind of romance based on sparring that we sometimes see between Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, and which I love. But really, this more physical way of expressing it comes across all wrong. The man, quote, drags Sophy to the door, and in the very last lines of the book, he, quote, in a very rough fashion, jerked her into his arms and kissed her, quote, savagely telling her that he disliked her excessively. And then he carted her off to the stables, away from the other people in the house. My first thought was that this particular description fit quite well into gender portrayals that show up in literature from authors I've long called the mid-century misogynist. This book, published in 1950, doesn't have that tone throughout, but it is hard for me to take it when it does show up. It hadn't occurred to me before that Jane Austen lived in a time and culture that encouraged a kind of subtlety that might have masked some of the disrespect and threat of physical force that was more open in the 1950s. And of course, at the same time this misogyny was sort of coming out of the closet, women were ironically experiencing, in many ways, much greater liberation than what existed in Austen's era. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why misogyny came to such a head during this period. I know many people love these novels and talk about them in a way that makes me think I would love them too. And eventually I will try another of Heyer's novels. Maybe just knowing what to expect and focusing more on the context will make the next Heyer novel I read seem more appealing, or at least less off-putting to me. Okay, onward. This Jane Austen July, many of us are collectively reading Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility. Although it's no longer my favorite, or even my second favorite Austen novel, it was when I first started reading her books. I first read Pride and Prejudice, which I thought was wonderful, when I was about 12 years old. But I wasn't quite ready to fully embrace the romance of characters who were thinking so explicitly about marriage. As soon as I finished Pride and Prejudice, I picked up Sense and Sensibility, and I was quickly drawn to the relationships between the family members, especially between the sisters. At the time, I very much saw myself as one of the two sisters, and I suspect you can guess which one felt like a mirror to me at the time. She still does. Today, I want to talk about two films based on Sense and Sensibility. At first, I plan to rewatch the two most famous screen adaptations. I love both of them very much, but instead, when I stumbled across a way to watch two new-to-me Sense and Sensibility films, I jumped. Let me tell you a little bit about them. The first one I saw was the 2024 film version of Sense and Sensibility put out by Hallmark. In many ways, it follows some of the sentimental style that Hallmark is known for. One of the big differences between this adaptation and others is that many of the actors are people of African descent. If only a few of the actors were black, I think I would have assumed that it was race-blind casting, which is fine with me. I don't care if a red-haired character from a book is played by an actor with blonde hair, or that actors playing children look like the actors playing their parents, or whatever. As long as actors are behaving as if they are the children or the parents or whatever, I don't care. My favorite example of this is in the Shakespeare play Comedy of Errors. It's become quite common for one set of twins to be played by two actors who look utterly unlike each other. In one of the versions I saw, one of the twins was a skinny, red-haired woman. The other was a black-haired bear of a man. And all that it took for them to be twins was that they learned to move in the same ways and talk in the same cadences and dress alike. When a much larger percentage of characters are, quote, casted blind, it sometimes means that they aren't cast blind at all, that this is a deliberate choice to offer a new lens or interpretation on the story. And at first I thought that might be what the decision was in the Hallmark Sense and Sensibility. At the beginning of the film, I wondered if, in this version, racism was at the core of why Henry's wife treated the sisters as she did. But overall, the film really doesn't seem to be especially invested in bringing a racial lens to understanding Austen's original. What is intended here seems to be more about inviting people of African descent into the world of Austen lovers, and possibly also into the world of BBC-style literary adaptations more broadly. All to the good in my book. In general, this version is set in an utterly conventional Regency-era setting, with only minor exceptions. There are a couple of references to Black culture, which I quite enjoyed. For example, Willoughby and Marianne share a love of the poet Phillis Wheatley. But in general, this adaptation is mostly a standard-issue version of Austen's tale. To be honest, the acting is not especially compelling. Not terrible, but not good enough to compete with the two phenomenal adaptations that are already out. The costumes sometimes look cheap and perhaps overly colorful, and the plot often feels too rushed for the story to quite make sense. There are moments where this adaptation feels more like a quickly made summation of the 1995 Sense and Sensibility than like an adaptation of Austen's work directly. I don't find this to be one of the best adaptations of Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibility, sense as in things you smell, is a modern retelling that came out several years ago. I hadn't seen it before, and honestly, I wish I had kept things that way. When the father of Eleanor and Mary Ann is arrested and jailed for major fraud, his family can no longer live in the elite style to which they have become accustomed. And the two older sisters lose job options because of the community's resistance to employ people related to their criminal father. The youngest sister, a very, very minor character in the film, is quite ill and needs expensive medication, which the older sisters, as well as their mother, need to pay for. The title stems from the fact that one of the sisters has a special hobby. She makes perfumed lotions with scents, that is. And after a variety of plot complications, as you might imagine, the scented lotion seems like it might be their chance to finance their lives. Of course, there is another complication as they try to make that plan come to fruition. And the three male love interests, completely mapped onto the three key men in Austen's original, are all involved in that complication and its resolution. The acting in this movie is terrible, almost charmingly terrible, if that makes any sense, and the storyline is really silly. Still, if you're a huge fan of comparing a classic original to a modern retelling, this one might be interesting, at least in a way. Jane Austen's classic depends on a particular historical understanding of gender, with its enormous emphasis on the necessity of marriage and its clear restrictions on female independence. So seeing how a modern writer or filmmaker tries to transform that plotline into something that works in contemporary times is sort of inherently interesting. But I would love to see it done better than it was done here. Okay, one more topic about both a book and a screen adaptation. A few days ago, I ran across a copy of Fay Weldon's Letters to Alice on first reading Jane Austen. I've known about this book for years, and I think someone must have mentioned it in a recent Jane Austen July TBR or something like that, because it's been very much on my mind recently. I was ecstatic when I saw it in a local little free library. And then, how perfect, Tim of the channel Tim's Too Many Books made a video where he talks about the impact Fay Weldon has had on his enjoyment and interpretations of Jane Austen. It's a wonderful video, which I definitely encourage you to go watch. One of the things he mentions is that Weldon was intimately involved in the 1980 screen adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, a version I have not watched, or at least not watched since the early 1980s, when I had only recently read Austen myself. I'm going on a hunt for the adaptation this evening. Tim points out how much Weldon's general approach in the book echoes certain decisions that were made in the film, saying that the two are a wonderful pairing. So that is one of the things I want to do later this month, or possibly soon afterwards, depending on my schedule. Well, thanks for joining me today as I talk about my Austen-related reading. I'm looking forward to hearing about what you've discovered this month yourselves, and whether you'd recommend anything you've read or watched. If you don't have a channel, but have been participating in Jane Austen July, tell me down in the comments. Take care, everyone. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.